Harlem, 11:40 p.m., October 1946. Cold air slid quietly through Lenox Avenue, brushing past the glow of storefront lights and drifting cigarette smoke. The street was alive the way Harlem always was at night. Not loud, not frantic, but steady. Voices rose and fell outside cafes. Laughter floated from a club down the block. Somewhere inside a second-floor apartment, a trumpet practiced the same slow phrase again and again. Nothing about the night looked unusual, but the street had grown watchful. Not tense, not frightened, just watchful. In Harlem, people learned early that danger rarely announced itself loudly. It moved quietly, like a man walking with his hands in his pockets, pretending he had nowhere important to be. Tonight, 3 strangers had walked into the neighborhood. They arrived separately. That was the first mistake. Men who belonged somewhere usually moved with the rhythm of the place. Their steps matched the street. Their eyes knew where to land. Their shoulders carried a familiarity that said they had walked these blocks 100 times. These 3 did not. Their coats were too new. Their silence too careful. Their eyes moved too often. Harlem noticed. Outside a barber shop closing for the night, an old man paused with a broom halfway through sweeping the sidewalk. He watched one of the strangers cross the street. The man kept walking, but the old man did not resume sweeping right away. Across the avenue, a waitress carrying a tray through the back door of a diner slowed, just enough to watch another one pass beneath the streetlight. She said nothing. Inside the diner, 2 men drinking coffee near the window saw the same thing. One of them leaned slightly toward the glass, watching the stranger disappear past the corner. "Not from here," he murmured. The other man nodded once. Harlem had a language that did not need speaking. A look held for half a second too long. A pause in conversation. A door closing more quietly than usual. Tonight, those signals moved up and down the avenue faster than any messenger could run. Someone had brought trouble into Harlem. And trouble had a destination. Inside a restaurant a few blocks away, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Warm light hung over small tables. Plates clinked softly. A jukebox in the corner played a slow blues tune that wrapped itself around the room like smoke. At a table near the back sat Bumpy Johnson. He was dressed the way he always dressed, sharp, clean, and composed. A dark suit, crisp collar, hat resting neatly beside him on the table. Nothing about him suggested urgency. Nothing about him suggested danger. To anyone who did not understand Harlem, he looked like a man finishing a quiet late dinner. A bowl sat half empty in front of him. Coffee steamed gently at his elbow. Across the table, a younger man shifted in his seat. The younger man had been watching the door every few seconds. Finally, he leaned forward. "Word came through Lenox," he said quietly. 3 men, asking questions. Bumpy stirred his coffee slowly. The spoon moved with deliberate calm. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "About you." The spoon tapped once against the porcelain cup. Bumpy set it down. He lifted the coffee and took a small sip. The younger man waited, expecting something. An order, a command, a change in the evening's plan. Instead, Bumpy simply nodded. "People ask questions every day," he said. The younger man hesitated. "These men ain't from Harlem." Bumpy placed the cup down carefully. "That's so." "Yeah." Silence settled over the table. Not awkward silence. Just the kind that allowed a man to think without being interrupted. At the bar, the bartender glanced toward Bumpy for half a second before returning to wiping a glass. Everyone in the room understood something without needing to discuss it. If strangers were asking about Bumpy Johnson, they were not tourists. And if they had come this far north, they had come for a reason. Still, the room remained calm. Because Bumpy remained calm, the younger man finally spoke again. "You want us to handle it?" Bumpy looked up. His eyes were steady. "No," he said. The answer came without hesitation. The younger man blinked. "No." Bumpy shook his head slightly. "Not yet." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together on the table. Outside the restaurant window, a car rolled slowly past, headlights gliding across the glass before disappearing into the dark. Men who travel this far, Bumpy said quietly, usually believe something. What's that? That the night belongs to them. The younger man frowned. Bumpy's voice remained calm. But Harlem don't work that way. 2 blocks south, one of the strangers stopped beside a newspaper stand that had closed hours earlier. He lit a cigarette, shielding the match from the wind with his palm. The flame briefly illuminated his face. Hard lines, tired eyes, professional eyes. This man had done work like this before. Across the street, another stranger leaned casually against a lamppost. He checked his watch. 11:52 p.m. The third man approached from the corner. They did not greet each other. They did not speak. But their eyes met. A silent conversation passed between them. Everything was moving according to plan. Find the target. Wait for the right moment. Leave the neighborhood before anyone understood what had happened. Simple. That was how these jobs were supposed to work. But something about the street felt wrong. Too quiet. Too many windows with lights still on. Too many people walking slowly instead of minding their own business. The man with the cigarette exhaled smoke and scanned the street again. Feels off, he muttered. The man at the lamppost shrugged. Every neighborhood feels off the first time. Still, he noticed something strange. No one was staring directly at them, but everyone seemed aware of them. A couple passing by lowered their voices. A taxi driver idling near the corner kept glancing into his rearview mirror. Even the man sweeping outside a storefront had not moved from the same spot in several minutes. The stranger flicked ash onto the sidewalk. You sure he's here tonight? Yeah. Same place. That's what they said. The man took another drag from the cigarette. Then he crushed it beneath his heel. Fine, he said. Then we wait. Back inside the restaurant, Bumpy Johnson finished his coffee. The younger man across from him had grown more restless. He shifted again. They're still out there. Bumpy placed a few bills on the table. They probably are. You're just gonna walk out there? Bumpy stood slowly. His movements were unhurried, controlled. I'm gonna go home, he said. The younger man stared at him. You know what they came for. Bumpy picked up his hat and settled it neatly on his head. Yes, he said. And you still walking out the front door? Bumpy adjusted his cuffs. Course I am. He began walking toward the exit. Halfway there, he paused beside the bar. The bartender looked up. You closing soon? Bumpy asked. Couple minutes. Bumpy nodded once. Good. The bartender understood the meaning behind the word. Good. Not because the night was ending, but because something was about to begin. Bumpy turned and continued toward the door. The younger man hurried after him. Bumpy. Bumpy stopped just before reaching the handle. What? The younger man lowered his voice. They got guns. Bumpy looked at him calmly. So do most men who come looking for trouble. Then he opened the door. The night air felt colder outside. Lenox Avenue stretched ahead beneath the dim glow of streetlights. A few people still walked the sidewalks. Cars moved slowly through intersections. Everything looked ordinary, but Harlem had already changed. Word had traveled. Quietly, efficiently. By the time Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk, half the neighborhood already knew strangers were hunting him, and Harlem had made a decision. No one announced it. No one organized it. It simply happened the way things always happened when Harlem protected its own. Windows stayed open. People lingered outside longer than usual. Taxi drivers took slower routes through certain streets. Men who had planned to go home remained nearby instead. Watching, waiting, because the men who had come north believed they were hunting one man. What they did not understand yet was that they had walked into a neighborhood that hunted together. 2 blocks away, the stranger near the lamppost straightened suddenly. There, he said quietly. Across the street, a figure had just exited a restaurant. Dark suit, calm stride, hat tilted slightly forward. The cigarette man narrowed his eyes. That him? The third man studied the figure carefully. Even from a distance, something about the way the man moved felt different. unhurried, unconcerned, as if he already understood the night better than they did. "Yeah," the third man said quietly. "That's him." The three strangers exchanged brief looks. The moment had arrived. They stepped away from their positions, slowly, carefully, beginning to close the distance. And for the first time that night, Bumpy Johnson was walking directly toward them. The night in Harlem did not belong to the loudest man. It belonged to the man who understood the street. Long before the three strangers stepped off their train and walked north with murder in their pockets, Harlem already had its order, its quiet balance, its own way of deciding who mattered and who did not. And in 1946, that balance had a center: Bumpy Johnson. Not because he demanded attention, because the neighborhood chose him. Harlem moved in layers. During the day, the streets were full of ordinary rhythms. Barbers opening their shops, kids running errands for their mothers, delivery trucks backing up into narrow alleys, men reading newspapers outside cafes while arguing about baseball and politics. But the real language of Harlem lived beneath that surface. It lived in the nods, in the quiet respect offered without words, in the understanding that some men walked through the neighborhood differently than others. Bumpy Johnson was one of those men. He did not rush. He did not shout. He did not surround himself with crowds of loud followers the way other bosses like to do. Most nights, he moved through Harlem with only one or two men nearby, sometimes none. Yet doors opened when he entered. Chairs appeared at crowded tables. And men who had never met him before still understood exactly who had walked into the room. That kind of authority could not be forced. It had to be earned. Years earlier, when Bumpy first began carving out his place in Harlem, the neighborhood had already seen its share of powerful men. Some ruled with money, some ruled with fear. Most of them disappeared quickly, because Harlem had a long memory. People remembered who helped when rent was short, who kept trouble away from the block, who respected the community that fed their power. Bumpy Johnson understood something many others did not. Control meant nothing without loyalty, and loyalty could not be bought. It had to be protected. On 135th Street, a barber named Curtis finished closing his shop for the night. He flipped the sign on the door from open to closed and began sweeping hair from the floor. A young customer still lingered in the chair. "You hear about the men walking around tonight?" the young man asked. Curtis nodded slowly. "Yeah. They say they looking for Bumpy." Curtis continued sweeping. "They probably are." The young man shifted in his seat. "You think something gonna happen?" Curtis leaned the broom against the wall. Then he turned to face the mirror. "You been in Harlem long?" he asked. "Whole life." Curtis nodded. "Then you know how this neighborhood works." The young man watched him. Curtis reached for the light switch but didn't flip it yet. "Men come into Harlem thinking they bringing violence," he said quietly. "Most of the time." He paused. "They just bringing themselves." The light went off. The barber shop went dark. A few blocks away, a small grocery store owner locked his front gate. As he pulled the metal grate down, he noticed a familiar taxi slowing near the curb. The driver leaned slightly out the window. "You seen Bumpy tonight?" the driver asked. The grocer nodded toward Lenox. "Restaurant on the corner." The driver considered that for a moment. "3 men came through earlier," he said. "Didn't belong here." The grocer finished securing the gate. "Yeah," he said calmly. "We know." The taxi driver nodded once. Then he drove off. That was how Harlem communicated. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. Inside a dim jazz club, the music had slowed to a low, smoky rhythm. A trumpet held a single note while the piano drifted softly beneath it. At a table near the back, 2 older men sat nursing glasses of whiskey. They had been watching the door most of the night. When one of the waitresses approached their table, she leaned down slightly. "He just left the restaurant," she whispered. One of the men nodded. "You see the others?" 3 of them, spread out. The men exchanged a look. "Professional," the waitress shrugged. "Look like it." The second man took a slow sip of his drink. "They're late," he said. The first man smiled faintly. "Harlem runs on its own clock." The music continued playing. But half the room had already begun paying attention to the street outside. Bumpy Johnson stepped calmly along the sidewalk. The younger man who had followed him out of the restaurant walked a step behind. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights washing across the pavement. Nothing about the scene looked dangerous. But Harlem had already shifted. Men leaned casually against doorways who had not been there 10 minutes earlier. Taxi drivers lingered at corners longer than usual. Even the street vendors seemed slower to pack their carts. No one spoke directly to Bumpy as he passed. They didn't need to. Respect had its own language. A brief nod, a slight movement of the head, a quiet acknowledgement. Bumpy returned those gestures the same way. Never dramatic, never exaggerated. Just enough to let a man know he had been seen. The younger man finally spoke. "They getting closer." Bumpy kept walking. "I know. You want us to call the others?" Bumpy shook his head slightly. "No." "But Bumpy." Bumpy stopped walking. The younger man nearly bumped into him. Bumpy turned slowly. "You ever watch a storm coming?" he asked. The question seemed strange. The younger man frowned. "Yeah." "You ever try to fight it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it's bigger than you." Bumpy nodded. "Exactly." He looked up the street. 3 figures had begun moving from different directions. Slowly, carefully, trying to appear casual. But Harlem had already noticed them long ago. "Those men," Bumpy said quietly, "believe they the storm tonight." The younger man glanced toward the approaching figures. "They got guns." Bumpy's voice stayed calm. "So do I. But there's 3 of them." Bumpy allowed himself a faint smile. "Not in Harlem." Across the avenue, one of the strangers slowed his pace. He had noticed something. People were watching. Not staring, but watching. Every storefront window seemed to contain someone standing inside. Every doorway held a quiet observer. It felt like walking into a room where everyone had already been discussing you. He leaned slightly toward the second man approaching from the corner. "You see this?" The second man nodded. "Yeah." "Feels wrong." The third man, moving from behind, joined them near the middle of the block. "You getting nervous?" he asked. The first man shook his head. "Just paying attention." He glanced again toward the man walking calmly down the sidewalk. The man in the dark suit. The one they had come to kill. Even from this distance, the stranger noticed something unsettling. The man was not looking for them, not scanning the street, not checking behind his shoulder. He was simply walking, as if the night already belonged to him. Back inside the jazz club, the trumpet note finally faded. The bandleader lowered his instrument and looked toward the window. "Something happening out there?" he asked quietly. One of the men at the back table stood. "Maybe," he said. The bandleader considered that. Then he lifted the trumpet again. "Keep playing," he told the musicians. The music resumed, because Harlem understood something outsiders rarely did. Life continued. Even when danger walked the street, Bumpy Johnson resumed walking. His pace never changed. The younger man beside him glanced nervously toward the 3 figures closing in. "Bumpy." Bumpy raised one hand slightly. Not a command. Just a small gesture, enough to silence the fear. "Relax," he said quietly. The younger man tried, but his eyes kept moving. "Whole neighborhood watching," Bumpy continued. "That supposed to make me feel better?" Bumpy looked ahead. "It should." The younger man frowned. "Why?" Bumpy's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who had lived too long to doubt the ground beneath his feet. "Because Harlem takes care of its own." He adjusted his hat slightly. "And tonight." The 3 strangers were now less than half a block away. Harlem watching very closely. The distance between them closed slowly. The streetlights hummed softly above. No one raised a voice. No one ran. The moment stretched longer with every step. And somewhere deep inside the neighborhood's quiet rhythm, the night was beginning to make its decision. The men who came north that night believed they understood violence. They had seen it in other cities. In back alleys behind gambling rooms. In quiet hotel corridors where arguments ended quickly. In empty warehouses where problems were solved with a gun and a short ride afterward. Violence, to them, was simple. You found the man. You cornered him. You finished the job. Then you disappeared before anyone decided to care. That was the system they trusted. But Harlem was not built like those other places. And the men walking toward Bumpy Johnson had not yet realized the difference. 3 days earlier, the order had been given in a smoke-filled office nearly 200 miles away. The rival boss sat behind a wide wooden desk, a glass of bourbon resting beside his elbow. His city was loud. Car horns outside. Elevated trains clattering through metal tracks. Men shouting across crowded sidewalks. Power in that city worked loudly. You showed it. You reminded people. You made sure nobody forgot. The boss believed Harlem worked the same way. He believed Bumpy Johnson was just another man holding territory with muscle and luck. And luck, he believed, could always run out. So he summoned 3 men. Not amateurs. Professionals. Men who had handled work like this before. They stood quietly in front of the desk while the boss explained the situation. "He's getting comfortable," the boss said, swirling the bourbon slowly. "That neighborhood up there treats him like a king." One of the men shifted slightly. "You want him scared?" The boss shook his head. "No." He leaned forward. "I want him gone." The room fell silent. The job had just changed. Scaring a man was easy. Killing a man with a name like Bumpy Johnson carried weight. But the boss continued speaking calmly. "You'll take the train tomorrow," he said. "Walk the streets a little. Learn his habits." One of the men asked the obvious question. "What about his people?" The boss shrugged. "Every man got people." He lifted the bourbon glass. "But every man bleeds the same." The men said nothing. Because in their line of work, hesitation had no value. The job was simple. Travel north. Find the man. End it. Then return before anyone understood what had happened. The train ride took most of the afternoon. Steel wheels humming against the tracks. Passengers reading newspapers, staring out windows, sleeping through the miles. The 3 men sat separately in the same rail car. They barely spoke. Not because they disliked each other. Because professionals rarely wasted words. One of them studied a folded map. Another quietly cleaned beneath his fingernails with a small pocket knife. The third watched the landscape slide past the window. He had heard of Harlem before. Everyone had. Music, nightlife, crowded streets. But reputation meant little to men who lived by contracts. Every neighborhood looked the same when a job began. And every neighborhood looked the same when it ended. At least that was what he believed. By the time the train rolled into the city, evening had already begun settling over the streets. The 3 men left the station separately. No conversation. No visible connection. They simply stepped into the crowd and disappeared into the flow of people moving north through the avenues. The plan was careful. Observe first. Strike later. One of the men reached Harlem just as the streetlights flickered on. The neighborhood surprised him immediately. Felt alive. Not chaotic. Not dangerous. Just full. Restaurants busy. Music drifting from doorways. People talking loudly on sidewalks. It did not feel like a place controlled by fear. That bothered him. Because places ruled by fear were easier to work inside. You frightened people. They looked away. They stayed silent. But Harlem did not feel silent. Felt aware. The first man walked slowly along Lenox Avenue. He paused at a diner window, pretending to read the menu painted on the glass. Inside, a waitress carried plates between crowded tables. A group of men laughed loudly near the counter. At another table, someone played dominoes. No one looked afraid. No one looked careful. That made him uneasy. He continued walking. Half a block later, he noticed something else. People were looking at him. Not directly, but enough. A glance that lasted half a second too long. A conversation that stopped briefly when he passed. The man told himself he was imagining it. Strangers always attracted attention in tight neighborhoods. Still, Something felt wrong. Across the avenue, the second man entered a small bar. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey. A low jazz record played from a corner phonograph. He ordered a drink and sat near the end of the bar. The bartender poured the whiskey and slid the glass across. "You visiting?" the bartender asked casually. "Passing through." The bartender nodded. "Lot of folks pass through." The man took a sip. "Busy neighborhood." "Usually is." The bartender wiped the counter slowly. Then he asked a question that sounded harmless. "You looking for somebody?" The man set the glass down. "No." The bartender nodded again. "Good." The stranger frowned slightly. "Why's that?" The bartender smiled faintly. "Most people who come looking for somebody in Harlem," he paused, "don't always find what they expect." The stranger finished his drink quickly. Something about the conversation made him uncomfortable. He left a few coins and walked out without another word. Behind him, the bartender watched the door close. Then he leaned slightly toward a man seated 2 stools away. "Another one," he said quietly. The man nodded once. Word traveled. The third man preferred rooftops. He climbed the narrow stairwell of a brick apartment building and stepped onto the roof as evening settled across Harlem. From above, the neighborhood looked different. Lights glowing through hundreds of windows. Music floating upward through the night air. Cars sliding along the avenues like slow rivers of metal. He studied the streets carefully. Eventually, he spotted the restaurant he had been told about. The place where Bumpy Johnson liked to eat late dinners. He leaned against the rooftop ledge and watched. The job was still simple. Wait for the right moment. Follow the man when he left. End it quietly. But as the hours passed, the man noticed something unsettling. People seemed to gather near that restaurant. Not crowds, just presence. Men leaning casually against nearby walls. Taxi drivers lingering longer than necessary. Pedestrians slowing as they passed. It looked almost like protection. The thought irritated him. No neighborhood protected a single man that much. Not in his experience. Still, the feeling remained. Something about Harlem was working differently. By the time the 3 men reunited near midnight, each of them carried the same quiet concern. They met beneath a dim streetlight. "Something strange here," the first man said. "Yeah," the second replied. The third glanced toward the restaurant down the block. "He's inside." The first man exhaled slowly. "You notice people watching?" The second man nodded. "Whole street. Think they know." The third man shook his head. "Doesn't matter." He reached inside his coat briefly, feeling the cold metal reassurance of the weapon hidden there. "We do the job," he said. "Then we leave." The other 2 nodded. That was the plan. And professionals followed the plan. Still, as they began moving back toward the restaurant, the first man felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He could not explain it. It was not fear, just a sense that the ground beneath the job was shifting. The kind of feeling a hunter gets when the forest grows suddenly quiet. He glanced once more up the street. At the calm figure of Bumpy Johnson walking beneath the streetlights. The man looked relaxed, unconcerned, almost patient. The stranger frowned, because men who were about to be killed usually looked different. They looked nervous. They hurried. They searched the shadows. But Bumpy Johnson did none of those things. He walked as if the night had already been decided. And the 3 men approaching him had not yet realized they were the only ones who didn't know the ending. Midnight crept slowly over Harlem. The hour did not arrive with bells or sirens. It arrived the way most things did in that neighborhood, quietly, patiently, as if the streets themselves understood time better than the clocks. A thin wind moved along Lenox Avenue, pushing bits of paper across the pavement and brushing the edges of coats. Streetlights hummed softly overhead. And somewhere between one block and the next, the night began closing in. At the center of it all walked Bumpy Johnson. His stride remained calm, measured, a man moving exactly the way he always moved. Behind him, the younger man who had followed him from the restaurant tried to keep his breathing steady. He could see the 3 figures ahead now. They were no longer pretending to wander. They were moving with purpose. slowly tightening the distance. "Bumpy," the younger man whispered. Bumpy did not look back. "I see them." The younger man swallowed. "They're spreading out. Looks like they planning to corner you." Bumpy adjusted the brim of his hat slightly as he walked beneath a street lamp. "That's the idea," he said. His voice carried no tension, just quiet observation. The younger man struggled to understand it. 3 armed men were walking directly toward them, and Bumpy Johnson looked as relaxed as if he were heading home after a late dinner. Across the street, a group of men stood outside a closed tailor shop. They leaned casually against the wall, their coats pulled tight against the cold. To anyone passing by, they looked like ordinary night owls lingering after a long evening. But their eyes followed the same scene unfolding down the block. One of them spoke under his breath. "They getting bold." Another man shook his head slowly. "No, just ignorant." A third man crossed his arms. "They think Harlem sleep." The first man glanced toward Bumpy Johnson. "He don't look worried." The second man allowed himself a small smile. "He ain't." The 3 strangers had begun moving into position. The cigarette man drifted toward the far sidewalk. The tallest of the 3 remained near the center of the street. The third approached from behind a parked car. They did not rush. Rushing was sloppy. Professionals understood patience. They would close the distance, block the path, and finish the work before anyone understood what had happened. At least that was the plan. But plans depended on control. And control was something Harlem did not give easily to outsiders. Further down the avenue, a taxi slowed near the curb. The driver leaned his elbow against the window frame and watched quietly. A fruit vendor who had already packed most of his cart remained beside it instead of leaving. 2 women exiting a late-night cafe paused near the door longer than necessary. The street looked ordinary, yet the air carried a quiet tension, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Bumpy Johnson stopped walking. The younger man beside him froze. "Why we stopping?" he whispered urgently. Bumpy looked calmly down the street. "Because they expect us to keep moving." The younger man glanced toward the approaching figures. "They almost here." "Good." The younger man blinked. "Good." Bumpy nodded once. "Better to settle things where everyone can see." The younger man stared at him. "You planning something?" Bumpy's expression remained unreadable. "I'm letting something happen." The 3 strangers slowed as they approached. The tallest of them stepped forward first. His coat shifted slightly as his hand moved near the inside pocket. He studied Bumpy Johnson carefully now. This was the man, the name they had been given, the target they had traveled hours to reach. Up close, Bumpy looked older than expected, calmer than expected, and far less nervous than any man in his position should have been. The stranger stopped about 15 feet away. His partners drifted wider, forming a loose triangle, blocking any easy escape. The street grew strangely quiet. Even the passing cars seemed to move slower. The stranger spoke first. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Bumpy looked at him. Not quickly, not sharply, just calmly. "Yes." The stranger nodded once. "Good." The word hung in the air. But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. A car door slammed somewhere behind him. The stranger turned his head slightly. A taxi had just parked along the curb. The driver stepped out, not aggressively, just standing beside the vehicle, watching. The stranger frowned. He looked back at Bumpy. "Looks like you got company." Bumpy glanced briefly at the taxi driver, then back at the stranger. "Harlem's a busy place." The stranger shifted his weight. His partners glanced around uneasily now. More people had stopped walking. A man leaning against a lamppost had not moved in several minutes. A couple across the street stood frozen beside a storefront window. And somewhere down the block, 2 men quietly stepped out of a doorway. No one approached. No one interfered. They simply watched. The stranger felt the back of his neck tighten. "What's this?" he muttered. Bumpy answered calmly. "This?" He gestured lightly toward the street around them. "This just Harlem." The second stranger spoke quietly from behind. We should do it. The tallest man nodded slightly. Yeah. He looked back at Bumpy Johnson. You got enemies, Johnson? Bumpy shrugged faintly. Most men do. Some of them pay well. Bumpy tilted his head slightly. That's so. The stranger slipped his hand deeper into his coat. The movement was small, but half the block noticed it. The taxi driver straightened. The men outside the tailor shop shifted slightly. The fruit vendor's hands tightened around the edge of his cart. Still, no one stepped forward. Harlem understood something about moments like this. Interfering too early only made things messy. Better to let the truth of the situation reveal itself. The stranger pulled his hand back out slowly. But instead of a gun, he held something smaller. A folded photograph. He held it up. Boss wanted to make sure we got the right man. He unfolded the photo and glanced at it. Then back at Bumpy. Looks like you. Bumpy studied the photograph briefly. Then looked at the stranger again. You came a long way to show me a picture. The stranger allowed himself a faint smile. No. His hand moved again. This time toward the gun. And in that exact moment, something shifted in the street. Not loudly. Not violently. Just enough. The stranger suddenly noticed something that made his stomach tighten. There were far more men on the sidewalks now. Men he had not seen arrive. Standing quietly. Watching carefully. Not threatening. Just present. The stranger's partners noticed it too. One of them whispered sharply. Too many eyes. The tallest man kept his gaze locked on Bumpy Johnson. But for the first time since arriving in Harlem, he realized something important. They were not surrounding Bumpy Johnson. They were standing inside his neighborhood. And the neighborhood had surrounded them. Bumpy spoke quietly. You still planning to do something tonight? The stranger said nothing. Bumpy's voice remained calm. You came a long way. The wind moved softly through the street again. Paper slid along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet played a lonely note from an open window. The stranger's fingers rested against the grip of the gun inside his coat. But suddenly, it did not feel like the smartest move anymore, because the night had changed, and Harlem was watching everything. For several seconds, no one moved. The wind slipped quietly down Lenox Avenue, brushing past coats and rattling a loose newspaper against the curb. A streetlight flickered once, then settled into its dull yellow glow. In the center of that stillness stood Bumpy Johnson. Hands relaxed at his sides. Eyes steady. The three men who had traveled north to kill him suddenly understood something they had not considered before. They were no longer controlling the moment. Harlem was. The tallest of the strangers shifted his weight. His fingers still rested against the grip of the gun hidden inside his coat. The metal felt colder now, heavier somehow. He had pulled a weapon on men before. Plenty of times. Usually the result was immediate. Fear. Panic. A desperate move to run. But Bumpy Johnson had not reacted at all. He simply stood there, watching, patient, as if he had already seen this ending. The stranger glanced quickly to his left, then to his right. More men had appeared. They weren't crowding close. They weren't making threats. They simply occupied the street. A man leaning against a lamppost. Two more standing beside a taxi. Another across the avenue near a storefront. Quiet, unmoving, watching. The stranger felt the trap now. Not a loud trap. Not a violent one. Patient one. The kind that closed slowly around a man until he realized escape had already disappeared. Behind Bumpy, the younger man whispered nervously. Bumpy. Bumpy lifted a finger slightly. Silence. The younger man obeyed immediately, because he understood something important about the man standing in front of him. Bumpy Johnson never rushed a moment like this. He allowed the other man to feel the weight of his own choices, to understand exactly where he stood. That was power. Not the gun. Not the numbers. The control of time itself. The tallest stranger finally spoke again. You got a lot of friends. Bumpy's voice remained even. Harlem's a friendly place. A faint ripple of quiet amusement moved along the sidewalks. Not laughter. Just recognition. The stranger's jaw tightened. You think this changes something? Bumpy tilted his head slightly. Don't it? The man hesitated, because suddenly the job looked very different. 3 hired guns had arrived expecting to corner one man in a quiet street. Instead, they had walked into the middle of a neighborhood that had quietly gathered around its own. And no one had raised a voice. No one had threatened them. Yet the message was perfectly clear. One of the other strangers stepped closer. You really think these people gonna stop us? His voice carried an edge now. Uneasy. Defensive. Bumpy looked at him calmly. No. The answer surprised everyone. Even the stranger. Bumpy continued. They ain't here to stop you. The man frowned. Then what they here for? Bumpy's eyes moved slowly along the street. At the taxi driver. At the men near the tailor shop. At the quiet figures standing in doorways. Then he looked back at the 3 strangers. They here to watch what happens next. The words settled heavily into the air. The strangers understood the meaning immediately. Witnesses. Not fighters. Not threats. Witnesses. If the strangers pulled their guns now, the entire street would remember. Every face. Every movement. Every second. And in a place like Harlem, memory traveled fast. Faster than trains. Faster than rumors. A man could disappear inside Harlem long before he ever reached the train station again. The tallest stranger swallowed slowly. He had been paid to kill a man, not to disappear himself. From across the street, the taxi driver lit a cigarette. The small flame briefly illuminated his face. He took a slow drag and watched the scene unfold. Beside him, another man leaned casually against the hood of the car. Think they smart enough to walk away? He murmured. The driver exhaled smoke. Depends how much they like breathing. The tallest stranger looked back at Bumpy Johnson. You expecting us to leave? Bumpy shrugged slightly. Up to you. That's it. That's it. The stranger studied him carefully. You ain't even reached for a gun. Bumpy's expression remained calm. Don't need one right now. Why not? Bumpy's voice carried a quiet certainty that seemed to settle over the entire street. Because the night already told you how this ends. The stranger said nothing, because deep down he knew Bumpy Johnson was right. The second stranger glanced nervously toward the edges of the block. More figures had appeared. Not aggressively, just present. Men stepping out of doorways. A couple standing beside a parked car. Someone watching from an apartment window above. Harlem had gathered. Quietly, patiently. The second stranger leaned toward his partner. This ain't worth it. The third man nodded once. Not tonight. The tallest stranger kept staring at Bumpy Johnson. But the certainty he had carried into Harlem hours earlier had begun to dissolve. He had expected fear. Instead, he had found something much more dangerous. Loyalty. And loyalty made neighborhoods unpredictable. Finally, the stranger removed his hand from inside his coat. Slowly, carefully, the tension across the street eased slightly. The man looked directly at Bumpy. Seems like you got the advantage tonight. Bumpy shook his head gently. Ain't about advantage. Then what is it about? Bumpy paused, then answered simply. Respect. The word lingered, because everyone on that street understood its weight. Respect was the currency Harlem valued most. And the 3 strangers had arrived carrying none of it. The tallest stranger nodded slowly. Then he stepped back. His partners followed. The triangle around Bumpy Johnson dissolved. No dramatic movement. No loud argument. Just 3 men understanding that the ground beneath them had shifted too far. As they began walking away, the stranger spoke one last time. You got lucky tonight. Bumpy's reply came calmly. No. He adjusted his hat slightly. You just finally noticed where you were. The 3 men continued walking down the block. No one followed them. No one threatened them. But the silent watchers remained exactly where they were. Until the strangers turned the corner. And disappeared. For a moment, the street remained still. Then the quiet rhythm of Harlem returned. The fruit vendor finished securing his cart. The men outside the tailor shop resumed their conversation. The taxi driver flicked his cigarette onto the pavement and climbed back into his car. No celebration, no cheering, just understanding. Bumpy Johnson had not needed violence tonight. The neighborhood itself had spoken. The younger man beside Bumpy finally exhaled the breath he had been holding. "That's it?" he asked. Bumpy began walking again. "That's it. They just leave." Bumpy nodded. "They smart enough." The younger man shook his head slowly. "They came all this way." Bumpy's voice carried quiet certainty. "Sometimes the longest trip a man takes." He glanced briefly down the empty street where the strangers had vanished. "Is learning when he in the wrong place." They continued walking through Harlem. And behind them, the neighborhood slowly returned to its ordinary midnight life. But everyone who had witnessed that moment would remember it. Because sometimes power did not arrive with gunfire. Sometimes it arrived with patience, with silence, with a neighborhood that refused to bow. And on that October night in 1946, Harlem had made something very clear. If a man came north to kill Bumpy Johnson, he had better be prepared to face Harlem first. Morning arrived slowly over Harlem. The sun climbed carefully above the brick rooftops, turning the early fog along the avenues into pale ribbons of light. Delivery trucks rattled through intersections. Store owners lifted metal gates from their storefronts. The smell of fresh bread drifted from bakeries opening their doors. To anyone passing through, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But Harlem remembered nights, and the night before had been important. Word did not travel through newspapers. No headlines were printed. No police reports described the moment. Instead, the story moved the way Harlem always moved information. Through voices, quiet conversations, and the subtle understanding shared between people who trusted each other. By the time the morning coffee was poured in the first diner on Lenox Avenue, people already knew what had happened. 3 men had come north looking for trouble, and they had walked away with something else entirely. Inside a small cafe, 2 older men sat by the window reading newspapers. One of them folded the page slowly. "You hear about last night?" he asked. The other man didn't look up. "Everybody heard. They say 3 out-of-town boys tried something." The second man nodded. "Yeah. What happened?" The man finally lowered his paper. "They realized they was in Harlem." That was explanation enough. At a barber shop on 135th Street, Curtis unlocked the front door and switched on the lights. The chairs gleamed under the morning sun pouring through the window. A young customer stepped inside moments later. "You open yet?" Curtis nodded. "Take a seat." The young man dropped into the barber chair, still curious. "People talking about something last night." Curtis draped a cloth around the man's shoulders. "People always talking. They saying some hitmen came up here." Curtis began sharpening his razor slowly. "That so?" "Yeah. Looking for Bumpy Johnson." Curtis paused. Then he smiled faintly. "Looks like they found Harlem instead." The razor slid carefully along the leather strap. "That usually enough." Across the avenue, a taxi driver pulled up beside a diner and stepped out to stretch his legs. The same driver who had watched the moment unfold beneath the streetlights hours earlier. He leaned against the hood of the cab while lighting a cigarette. Another driver walked over. "You was out late last night," the second man said. "Yeah. You see anything interesting?" The driver exhaled smoke slowly. "Depends what you call interesting." "Well," the driver shrugged. 3 men learned a lesson." "What lesson?" The driver smiled slightly. "You don't come into somebody's house and start making threats." The second driver nodded thoughtfully. "Especially not his whole neighborhood." By midday, Harlem had returned fully to its rhythm. Children ran along sidewalks. Shopkeepers argued over prices with suppliers. Music drifted from open apartment windows. But beneath all of it lived a quiet certainty. The neighborhood had seen something important the night before. Power in most cities arrived loudly. Sirens, gunfire, men shouting over each other in crowded rooms. But power in Harlem often looked different. It looked like restraint, It looked like a man standing calmly while the entire street silently supported him. And no one understood that better than Bumpy Johnson. Late that afternoon, Bumpy walked into a familiar cafe. The bell above the door chimed softly. Several men inside glanced up. A few nodded respectfully. Bumpy returned the nods without ceremony and sat down at a small table near the window. The waitress approached almost immediately. "Coffee, please." She poured the cup carefully, then leaned slightly closer. "You all right after last night?" Bumpy looked up. "Why wouldn't I be?" She shrugged. "People talking." Bumpy stirred the coffee slowly. "People always talking." The waitress smiled faintly. "Well, they sang Harlem stood up for you." Bumpy shook his head gently. "Harlem stood up for itself." She considered that, then nodded. "That sound more like it." Across the room, two younger men whispered quietly while watching Bumpy Johnson. "You think those guys coming back?" one asked. The other shook his head immediately. "Not if they smart." "Why not?" The man leaned back in his chair. "Because last night wasn't about 3 hitmen." He nodded toward Bumpy. "It was about a neighborhood." The younger man frowned slightly. "What you mean?" The older man spoke carefully. "Anybody can hire a gun." He gestured subtly toward the street outside. "But you can't hire Harlem." That was the lesson the night had delivered. The 3 strangers who had traveled north believed they were hunting a man. They had studied his habits, tracked his movements, prepared their weapons, but they had misunderstood something fundamental. Bumpy Johnson did not stand alone in Harlem. He stood within it, protected by something far stronger than bodyguards, protected by loyalty, by memory, by the quiet agreement shared among people who believed the neighborhood deserved respect. That kind of protection could not be bought, and it could not be broken easily. Weeks later, the story had already begun to change shape. Some said the strangers had drawn their guns. Others claimed dozens of men surrounded them. A few insisted the entire block had stepped forward at once. Stories grow that way. They stretch. They collect new details. But the truth of that night remained much simpler. 3 men had arrived believing violence would give them power. Instead, they discovered something else. Calm authority. And a community that understood exactly when to stand still. Late one evening, a young man walking beside Bumpy Johnson finally asked the question many people wondered. "You ever worried somebody gonna try again?" Bumpy considered the question while lighting a cigarette. The flame flickered briefly in the dark. Then he took a slow drag. "Maybe," he said. "That bother you?" Bumpy exhaled smoke toward the streetlight above. "No. Why not?" Bumpy looked around at the familiar blocks of Harlem. The storefronts, the apartments, the people who nodded quietly as he passed. "Because men who come here with the wrong idea," he paused, "usually leave with a better one." The younger man smiled. "Yeah." They continued walking, and Harlem continued breathing around them. Alive, watchful, loyal to its own rhythm. Because the lesson of that October night in 1946 would not disappear. It would pass from one conversation to another, from barber chairs to taxi stands, from late-night diners to quiet apartment windows. A simple truth. If someone came north to kill Bumpy Johnson, they weren't just facing a man. They were facing Harlem. And Harlem never stood alone.